$45B?
Yes, for The Telltale Heart, 1934.
I don't understand, Ben. $45B?
Yes.
For Telltale Heart...
1934.
1934?
Yes. Directed by Brian Desmond Hurst.
Is it still British?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, well, welcome to Scream Scene. What a cold open. Thank you so much for listening. My name's Sarah.
And I'm Ben.
And welcome to the show. Ben, what? So we missed a movie in 1934.
Yeah. So
which you discovered in your research, I presume.
No, I've known about this since 1934. We've
just been on hiatus for so long. You were like, "Hey, we got to do it as soon as we can."
No. So what happened is back in 1934, or at least back when the show was in 1934, I spent forever trying to find this movie and could not track down a copy anywhere. Like if you had a membership to the British Film Institute as like a British citizen, you could like request access to view a copy or something like that. But like otherwise there was just nothing. So I just gave up on trying to find this movie and we just skipped it way back when.
Okay.
And then in trying to find The Telltale Heart 1960, a British Telltale Heart feature-length adaptation from 1960 that would have been our next regular episode, it turns out someone finally put the 1934 version online. So I figured we would sort of loop back around, get this one, and then do the 1960 version.
Okay, so we don't suddenly have British citizenship.
No.
Okay, well, that's too bad. I've been, working on my Cockney accent.
Oh, no.
Well, luckily, I think my research is pretty the same.
Yeah.
Do you want me to dive in?
Yeah, let's dive into talking about The Telltale Heart. Thank you for being
my flexibility.
Yes, your flexibility with this surprise.
Oh, I mean, it doesn't impact what I do.
Yeah.
Much has been said on Scream Scene already about Edgar Allan Poe in the past. So
he married his cousin of 13 years.
That grammatically implies other things, Ben. Let me so I'm going to give a highlight reel.
Okay, gotcha.
All right, so Edgar Poe was born in January 1809 to two actors. That didn't last long. Ultimately, he was raised by the Allan family, but never formally adopted. But that's where the Allan in his name comes from. Throughout his life, he struggled with gambling and more so alcohol, both because of when your parents are alcoholics, it tends to be a bit of a hereditary problem. But I feel like also circumstances lended itself to his proclivities towards that. He was one of the first people to make a go of writing as his sole source of income, either as an author or an editor at different writing literary magazines. This is particularly why most of his output are poems and short stories, because those are easy to get into periodicals.
Right.
Though he has written a novel. He's most famous for detective stories, mystery stories, things that are macabre, and of course, gothic. Now, The Telltale Heart is a short story that was published in January 1843 in the Pioneer Literary Magazine. To give you an idea of where he is right now, as Ben kind of shot the gun a bit ahead of me. I don't think that's the actual turn of phrase, but in any case, so Edgar married his 13-year-old cousin Virginia Clem in 1835. In 1842, so the year before this short story, is when she showed her first signs of tuberculosis with a very major attack while singing, and she never fully recovered. Hence, Edgar's alcoholism increased in frequency. Despite success at his current editor post at Graham's Literary Magazine, he was let go, presumably because of his struggles with alcohol, and he was trying to find new work at this time that the short story was published. Telltale Heart is a very well-known short story of Poe's, but Poe really skyrocketed to fame in his contemporary time with The Raven, which is 2 years from this point.
Okay.
The Telltale Heart features an unreliable narrator who lives with this old man who has this vulture-like evil eye. And our narrator, if you read between the lines, he basically has anxiety and hyper-focuses on this eye, becoming increasingly anxious and creeped out by the eye to the point that the narrator ends up killing the old man. You know when you hyperfocus so much that that's the only thing you can see and deal with?
You know when you hyperfocus on something you don't like about a person so much that you murder them?
I plead the fifth. So to hide the body, the narrator chops it up and hides the body parts and organs underneath the floorboards. Now, a neighbor called the police because they heard a yell from the old man. So the narrator shows the police around and says, like, oh, yeah, the old man's, like, visiting friends in the country or whatever. But he keeps hearing a thumping underneath the floorboards. And in classic hyperfocus fashion, it becomes louder and louder to their ears, but only the narrator is hearing it. The police don't hear any of this. Eventually, it gets so loud in their ears that they confess to the cops. Throughout all of the telling of this story, the narrator isn't trying to be like, I'm innocent. They're saying, no, but I'm sane, actually. Like, I had very rational reasons for killing the old man. I thought about this in a very precise manner. I have intelligence. I'm rational. Almost in a doth protest too much element. What's interesting, and probably why Poe had this angle about this short story, is because in 1843, so the year that this was published, there was some legal controversy about the insanity defense. In England, in the legal courts, they established the Macnaghten rule, which is basically almost like a legal test used to define insanity when someone is trying to plead insanity in a case.
Right.
This was in reaction to the plaintiff, the person charged with murder, the defendant, Macnaghten. He got acquitted through a case of mistaken identity because he had intended to kill the Prime Minister, Robert Peel.
Got it.
But this guy looked like him, so he killed him by mistake.
Right, which is not a crime, of course.
Of course. Well, here's the thing. They acknowledged, yeah, he killed a guy. But clearly, someone who's trying to kill the Prime Minister is insane. Therefore, he should be acquitted. And that worked. But there was such pushback on the courts that even the Queen got involved. So they established this Macnaghten rule about how to determine whether someone is sane or not during a legal case. So I can see a pretty clear line here to the telling by the narrator in this short story.
What's funny is the narrator is insisting that he is sane despite all evidence to the contrary, which means he wouldn't get off in court, he would.
Yeah, but it's I don't know. It's I thought it was quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell me about this. I need to cast my mind back. 1934, 1943?
1934.
God, that's so far back. Okay, what's a movie that we saw that year?
So this would be coming right after, I think, House of Mystery, and right before Black Moon, which was Racism the Movie. Yeah.
Listen, you're saying episode 45B, and we're in the 300s.
Yes.
So, What was House of Mystery? Did
House
that
of
have Bela
Mystery.
Lugosi?
No, House of Mystery was like a typical like old dark house story with a gorilla on the loose, but then there's a guy who's pretending to be the gorilla on the loose in a gorilla suit to commit the murders and get away with it. And it's the one where like everyone runs around the house for the whole length of the movie until like the last like 10 minutes are the inspector explaining the plot to everyone, and we frequently bring it up as an example of don't do that.
Now, I hear what you're saying as, like, that being the synopsis.
Yes.
But that's also so nondescript that it could apply to many others. But I think I know
That's
which
fair,
one
that's
you're
fair.
talking about.
Black
So,
Moon is the one where they are in the Caribbean and there's
Yeah.
the rebelling natives. This movie is British, so to put your mind in that time period, this was rated H for horrific
Yeah.
by the BBFC, so it's that era. And this came after The Ghoul, but before The Man Who Changed His Mind on like our timeline of British horror movies.
excellent.
Yeah.
Man, Man Who Changed His Mind is good. But focusing on this movie.
Yes. So while The Avenging Conscience, a movie we covered in episode 3, incorporated elements of The Telltale Heart into its plot with like the freaking out about the dude being alive or whatever under the floorboards. The first full film adaptation of The Telltale Heart was a 1928 American short film, 20 minutes long, directed by Leon Shonroy. Today's movie is the first talkie adaptation. And as I mentioned, it's barely a feature film. It is 55 minutes long, which counts as a feature film, but oh boy, not a very long movie. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that means we're not too far into like Grinch Who Stole Christmas territory where we're having to like turn a short story into like a 2.5 hour movie and we're inventing a ton of like extraneous characters and plot lines to like fill in the blanks.
Why do you always come for Jim Carrey?
But yeah, this movie was a quota quickie. So this was back in the days when for British theaters to be allowed to show American films, which everyone wanted to see and made all of the money, the British government had passed some laws saying you have to show X number of British films per American film you screen. And there wasn't enough British films being made to like meet that. So suddenly the British film industry like exploded with people making all of these quota quickies, which like was the point of the law, was to kind of therefore improve the British film industry by kind of forcing it to, right? This film was produced by Harry Clifton, who is described on his Wikipedia page as an eccentric.
For that to be like
That's
in
the
your
first
description,
thing.
that's the first thing. He I think he was more than that.
So here's the thing, Sarah. I want you to guess. Tell me, what do you think the difference between an eccentric and like a person with severe mental illness is?
I plead the fifth.
So the answer is money. When you're rich,
That's fair, because I was thinking like Howard Hawks.
yeah.
Howard Hughes.
When you're rich, you can be eccentric. When you're, a normal person and you do the same behaviors, they tend to go to more drastic measures to deal with you. So Harry Clifton was born to this wealthy land-owning family in Britain. And when I say wealthy land-owning family, I mean like they had like the family seat. They owned multiple estates and property and land all across the UK. But the family seat had been in their family, this like big manor house, since 1606.
Oh, so they're like aristocrats?
Yes, we're talking aristocrats here. And so Harry Clifton was educated at Oxford, where he met Evelyn Waugh, who came to believe that the entire Clifton family was insane. Harry's mother, Violet, believed that Waugh's novel Brideshead Revisited was based on the Cliftons, and this infuriated her.
Sure.
And his father died in 1928, leaving Harry the various family lands and estates, which they had held for centuries, and which he began selling so as to finance various schemes, like...
Schemes like Scooby-Doo schemes?
No, like buying abbeys to turn them into movie studios, or becoming involved in the occult and paying money to rise up in the ranks of the, you know, the cult, you know, arcane.
You can just say
hierarchy.
Cult. You can cut off the part.
Buying dinners.
Everyone was doing these things, dude.
Buying dinners for the invisible white goddess, a deity that Harry believed in and took out for dinner on Thursday nights, but like no one can see or hear except for him. Purchasing.
That's just him wanting to go for dinner alone.
Buying 2 dinners. Purchasing Fabergé eggs for a wife who divorced him after 6 years. Publishing several books of poetry, racing horses as an amateur jockey, collecting art, and of course gambling.
Collecting art, that's the height of the eccentricity.
Well, you collect the art and then you sell it so that you can afford your gambling.
Yeah.
Harry was the kind of guy who was frequently taken in by con men and often started grandiose, expensive projects like buying an abbey to turn it into a movie studio before losing enthusiasm and leaving them completely unfinished.
So he had ADHD.
Like the time that he wanted to build a zoo in his hometown, bought the land, started construction, and then just... stopped.
No, dude has ADHD, 100%.
His friends would warn him about these con men who would try to like get his money for like these various, you know, cons. And his response was like, yeah, but I like the bad ones. He died in 1979, penniless and childless, having sold off everything his family had ever owned since 1606.
Oof. But he helped make this movie.
Yes, so it was his friendship with Brian Desmond Hurst that led him to finance The Telltale Heart, writing a 3,000-pound check on an unfolded packet of cigarettes, which was surprisingly honored by the bank.
Well, yeah, the weight that his name probably carries.
Yeah. So Hurst was like a weird guy to be friends with. Clifton.
You know who this guy is? He's fucking Toad or whatever.
Yeah, of Toad Hall? Yeah, absolutely. 100%. 100%. Hurst is like a really interesting guy for Clifton to have been friends with. I don't really know what the nature of their friendship was. Hurst was known to be gay, so part of me starts to think in that direction. I don't really know. The reason I say he was an odd person for Clifton to be friends with is that Hurst was a working class Irishman from Belfast, born in 1895.
All right.
He served in the British Army in World War I and later explained his allegiances as follows. I would fight for England against anybody except Ireland.
Yeah.
Because an Englishman is worth 20 foreigners, but an Irishman is worth 50 Englishmen.
Nationalism. Oh, boy.
After the war, Hurst moved to Canada and studied at the Toronto College of Art. He got his start in movies when he headed down to Hollywood and worked as an extra in a bunch of John Ford movies. And that's who he learned about like set management and directing from, by like observing John Ford. And then he returned to Britain in 1933 and settled in London, directing films during the Quota Quickie era. The Telltale Heart was his first feature film as a director, but it was followed by a career of classics like Ourselves Alone, which is about the Irish War of Independence, On the Night of Fire, which is about the London Blitz, Theirs is the Glory, about the Battle of Arnhem, and the 1951 film Scrooge, starring Alistair Sim, which was very much like the definitive movie version of A Christmas Carol for the boomer generation.
Yeah.
Hurst remains today one of Ireland's most celebrated directors.
So he starts off with a horror movie. It sounds like he doesn't ever come back.
No. The Telltale Heart was shot at Elstree Studios. It features basically an amateur cast, so I have nothing to say about any of them, unfortunately. Its style owes a lot to the silent era, which won it some recognition when it came out as a novelty. You know, in the mid 30s, there was people who, like, at Elstree Studios, you know, someone would say, like, oh, what's the kid, you know, one soundstage over working on, kind of thing. And someone would reply, like, oh, that guy, yeah, he thinks he's making a silent movie. The film's H rating caused it to be withdrawn from many cinemas in the UK that refused to show it. I'm looking forward for how tame it will be, because wow, the British would just dub anything horrific if, like, a scene was dark or something. In the US, it was released as Bucket of Blood.
Wait a minute.
Not to be confused with the later Roger Corman picture. I'm not aware of any home video release for this movie. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I could not find it online for years. Again, episode 45B, we are like in the 300s, as Sarah said. Like, it's been a while, but it finally showed up online, courtesy of a YouTube account called Bob Fear.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this seems like a deep cut that only the biggest Hurst heads will go looking for, and Scream Scene folks. So if you want to watch along, you can find our YouTube playlist on our website, screamscenepodcast.com. You are going to hear a brief musical interlude, and when we come back, we will discuss The Telltale Heart from 1934, directed by Brian Desmond Hurst.
See you on the other side, everybody. Welcome back to Scream Scene, everybody. We just finished watching The Telltale Heart from 1934. Sarah, what'd you think?
It's hard going back 25 years, you know?
That's fair, that's fair.
But overall, it was a pretty good showing.
Yeah, it's a movie.
I would hope so. We only review movies, Ben.
That's fair, that's fair.
Did you not like it?
No, I did like it.
Okay.
It really doesn't add much to the story, like to the short story.
I appreciated how one-to-one of an adaptation it was. It still takes some liberties, but you kind of have to in some form with short stories to feature adaptations. But I did appreciate that.
The biggest addition, I think, is really like the obligatory love interest.
Yeah.
And one thing I did appreciate about her is that she remains as vaguely defined as the narrator and the old man. So she doesn't like stand out. She's just as one note as all the other characters. The main way that we get up to 50 minutes in this movie, other than the inclusion of an obligatory love interest, is that we do everything very, very slowly, which sometimes adds to the atmosphere and the sense of unease, that like classic Edgar Allan Poe sort of uneasy atmosphere, and sometimes comes across as padding for time.
Yes, padding for time, but also there's an element to older movies and that silent film nature that you talked about, that this film is kind of evoking, that lends itself to, well, we got to see this guy get up from his chair, walk over to the desk, pull out the wine, pour the wine, put the wine away, and walk back.
Yeah.
You know, and like I said, we're like 25 years after this in the context of the regular show. So I'm trying to give it some leeway with that.
Absolutely.
But let me give a brief synopsis.
Sure. Yeah. Is there enough different from the short story to make like a synopsis of the movie worthwhile?
Well, you're putting me on the spot, and now I have to say that I have not read the short story. So way to call me out, Ben.
Oh, I didn't mean to make you admit that. on live
It's not live
podcasting.
I just think it's worthwhile.
Totally.
So as Ben kind of said with the girlfriend fiance character, the girl, everyone here doesn't really have a name. So we have the boy, who's our main narrator, and the old man. Now the boy, I'm going to keep calling him the boy to help differentiate him from the old man.
Right.
But
he's a young man.
Young man. So the film, this is part of why I think it's worthwhile to go through the film, because it opens in an asylum of some kind. Our boy gets taken to some administrators, and he explains his story to basically be like, I'm sane. Why am I in here? I don't deserve to be in here. If I explain to you what led me to be here, you'll understand that I don't need to be in this asylum.
The classic sign of not being mentally ill, over-explaining everything that you did to everyone to make sure that there are no misunderstandings.
Yes, absolutely. If I just explain myself enough, obviously you'll understand. So it flashes back to the boy living alone in this rented room / apartment in this bigger house. Now he's an artist. He clearly has this relationship with this girl. It's pretty serious. I got the feeling that they were engaged, but I don't remember if they ever actually said fiance. And he's been feeling ill. It's unclear if this has just always been his temperament, but he basically can't sleep because he hears every little sound, and he has seizures. He recently had one. Luckily, the old man who lives below him brought him some wine and kind of took care of him to kind of bring him back to reality. Now, unfortunately for the boy, with his seizure, they used the word seizure, but it almost looked like more paralysis because he's like conscious and he's aware of the old man taking care of him, but he's frozen and he can't move. And the old man's eye is just so gross and so close, and he gets so freaked out by it that his brain becomes so fixated on this gross eye that the old man has, which leads him to believe that basically he needs to kill him to be rid of the eye, because the eye seems like it's following him everywhere. He goes on this cute date with his fiance into the woods, and they find some old gnarled trees, and he sees the eye in these trees. So he's very disturbed by all this. Now he explains that, I came in like a few times into the old man's room with the intent to kill him, and then just couldn't go through with it. But this final time,
couldn't go through with it because his eyes were closed. And so like, if he didn't see the gross eye, he lost his nerve on killing him.
Yeah. So the last time he goes in, he sees the eye, and he ends up like, he has a knife, and they kind of struggle, but the old man's kind of knocked out. So the boy ends up smothering him, and you get the sound effects of the old man's heartbeat slowing and then stopping. He puts him underneath the floorboards, and he's like, cool, now maybe I can get some sleep. Except the cops come and knocking on the door because a neighbor heard the old man scream. From here, it's pretty much based exactly on the short story. The police are like, we need to have a look around. So the boy shows him around, come into the old man's room. He explains old man's out in the country. Inexplicably, maybe to seem normal, he offers the cops some wine. So they're in here even longer. And that's when he starts to go like, am I hearing the heartbeat? What is that? Oh God, do they hear it? And then he starts to kind of get very, very nervous and anxious, and it ultimately explodes into him going like, you fools, like you don't even know what's underneath your feet. And then they pull up the dead body. And then he's taken away from the administrators. So that's the end of the movie. As Ben said, it's like 50 minutes, so barely a feature-length film. As I said, I think it was very well done, but again, the problem of adapting a short story is that you do need to have some means of padding things out for it to be a feature.
Yeah, and Edgar Allan Poe especially can be difficult, as we've seen over the years, because basically in a lot of Poe's classic, well-known short stories like Telltale Heart or The Raven or Fall of the House of Usher, nothing happens. Like
all of it is internal.
Yeah.
And so it's really tough for both filmmakers and the actors to externalize that.
I once heard Poe's writing described as disembodied climaxes floating in a sea of atmosphere. Like exciting stuff always happens at like the end of a Poe story, but there aren't really events that lead up. It's just people being unsettled in a house until one day the house collapses.
The ghosts of climaxes.
Right.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the filmmakers, what was the full name of the director?
Brian Desmond Hurst.
Brian Desmond Hurst. I made the joke in the first half of like, well, Hearst heads should go see this movie. Yes, you should. I think this movie is very well made, very well shot. The way that they use light and even sound to cultivate an atmosphere is very impressive. Obviously, 1934, it's fairly early in talkies. I understand why they're going for a silent film approach. But when the boy is talking about how, like, I can't sleep because I can just hear everything, you also hear all those things. And I thought that was a really nice touch that we've seen some horror movies just not do.
Sure.
And take that leap and use the medium to tell the story.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence of a talented filmmaker at work here.
Yeah.
Shots and angles are very well chosen, very well lit. There's definitely, from like the beginning of the movie, a for sure influence of German expressionism here.
Yes.
With like the angles and the shots and the framing and the shadows and everything. I think the cast has been very well chosen physically. Like they perfectly embody these roles of like the anxious young man, the decrepit old man, the beautiful young woman. I think the makeup effect for the old man's eye is also fairly well done for 1934.
Yeah, you get a very good close-up of it when the boy is having his paralysis moment. And the old man actor, his eye is closed, and they've put almost like an eye patch thing on top of it and painted that to look like this bulbous eye. Mm-hmm. And the actor is able to move his physical eye, and it looks like it kind of makes the fake eye pulsate. I thought it was very well done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the acting definitely shows the influence of the silent period.
Yeah.
That said, there are elements that certainly betray the beginner nature of this production, that it's, Hearst's first feature film, that the cast is a bunch of amateurs. I think there's a lot of like weak line delivery here.
Yes.
When people actually do have to speak, it's a little amateur hour. I appreciate that they like are doing all the sound effects so we get the sense that this guy can hear everything, but it's not like well mixed. Mm-hmm. Like it's very poorly recorded. But yeah, there's certain hallmarks where like it almost feels like I'm watching a student film.
I can see that because you can feel like a bit of the ambition of the. I would agree with the acting. The other problem with it, and I think this is because it's an amateur actor playing the boy, but the acting is fairly one note.
Yeah.
He starts super anxious, and not just because we start in the asylum, but even in the flashback. Mm-hmm. So because he starts so high, there's nowhere for him to go.
Yeah.
The filmmaking is doing all it can to build tension, and the actor is trying, and there are moments where he does succeed, but it does kind of feel like, you started at the top and you're just stuck there now.
Yeah. I do like that the movie goes out of its way to show how nice and harmless the old man is.
It was so good. I really enjoyed that. The poor guy's just like, oh, I brought you some wine. Like, oh, I heard something fall. Are you okay?
Yeah, he's so nice. And the young man's just like, but that eye though. And it's funny because the short story like has the narrator saying like, yeah, I had nothing against the old man. He just had this like weird eye and I needed to kill him for it, but I'm not crazy. And you don't really know, like, because he's clearly is crazy, you don't know how unreliable the narrator might be. So when he says like, oh yeah, I swear I had nothing against the old man, it was just because of his like weird eye. You don't know if he might be lying, right? If he might be trying to cover for some other motive through like an insanity plea or something.
Yeah.
But this movie makes it very clear, like, no, this is just like a really nice kind of like doddering old man who just wants to be kind. And I really liked that. It definitely shows how insane the narrator is. I do think that the time spent with the love interest felt very
long.
yeah, and kind of like rote.
Yeah.
Like it's only here because we have to have a girl in here.
Well, here's the thing. That's when Hurst is showing off that he can film on location.
Right. I do think that some of that time, though, could have been better spent on showing how much the eye bothers the narrator more convincingly.
Yeah.
Because the movie goes out of its way to make the old man so harmless. It's almost like too much of a leap that like, and then I decided to kill him, even though he'd only ever been nothing but nice to, like everything but,
yeah.
You know, he's always been nice to me. He's always been this really nice guy. I feel like we needed to feel how bothered the narrator was. And I kind of feel like all the nice times at the park, like I get that he sees the eye everywhere and we get that impression, but it's almost like this guy's life is too nice for him to be like this neurotic.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Part of it, I think, is, you know, he started so hot, but like, I think if the movie had trusted itself rather than trying to do a shotgun of like, oh look, I can shoot out on location, and like they do look beautiful, they're on a fucking stream, like cool, good job, Hurst, like you are talented. But had just dedicated it to being almost like a bottle episode of like, you are just in this apartment and all you can do is hear things and like
and see this eye.
Like we should have been hearing, now this might be expecting too much of a movie from 34, but we should have been hearing like all these sounds, like, you know, hearing the old man chew with his mouth open. Sure. And you look over and the eyes like oozing or something. Like you should have been hearing all these gross things, and then like, you know, making it clear that that shot is from the boy's perspective, and then we cut to whatever that's called, where it's like
an objective perspective.
And the old man's just like being totally normal.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you pointing out that like he starts too anxious and has nowhere to go helps me understand like why the ending didn't really work for me, like the climax where the narrator confesses for the police. Like I remember watching that and it just didn't feel like the catharsis that it should have. I thought that maybe it was because like a moment like that could really use close-ups, and a lot of that ending climax was played out in a long shot, so it doesn't have like the right impact that it should have. But I think you're right in that he doesn't have enough runway to like build up to this like madness, because he's too anxious to start with. Yeah. Still, I do think this is a really promising effort for like a first-time director. Yeah,
it makes me a little disappointed that he never returned to horror, because I think he could have really done some amazing work.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, let's move on to ranking. So I found it surprisingly super easy to rank this.
Weirdly same. I wonder if we ended up in the same spot.
Okay. Can I go first?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, you made me all excited. So first, I was like, what are all of the other movies from 1934? So I can accurately judge where this lines up.
Yeah, fair.
From top to bottom, we have The Black Cat at number 16. That's the Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff one. Then at ranked at number 135 is El Fantasma del Convento. Ranked at number 250 is Black Moon. Ranked at number 258 is Sex Maniac. Ranked at number 285, House of Mystery.
Yeah.
And still in 1934 was Das Monjes, which did not rank.
Right.
So looking at that, I was like, all right. I think what I need to do is look at the broader decade. So then I was like, okay, what else was in 1930-ish?
Well, there's a lot.
Yes, but what caught my eye was White Zombie at number 147. That's 1932. I thought it was quite apt to compare it to White Zombie because the White Zombie was all about doing a silent film homage.
Okay, yeah.
And I thought, you know what? Like, White Zombie really works because they have Bela Lugosi. But, like, if you were to compare apples to apples, I think Telltale Heart could potentially go above this because of its dedication to not having a book of exposition.
Okay.
Now, below White Zombie, you know, I am willing to go as low as, say, 152, where 1933's The Ghoul is. I think 34's Telltale Heart is a better horror movie than The Ghoul. And then if you look above White Zombie, literally right above, is Orlax Hund from 1924. And throughout watching Telltale Heart, Ben and I kept turning to each other to remark on the boy and his facial expressions and how much it was clear he was cast for his resemblance to Conrad Veidt's Cesare. And of course, Conrad Veidt is in Orlax Hund. I don't think this Telltale Heart is better than that because at least Orlax Hund manages to sustain a lot more of that tension, even while it tries to balance the strange material that it's adapting from. So for me, my spot is right below Orlax Hund and above White Zombie.
Huh. So I ended up higher than you.
Interesting. That's unexpected.
But in looking at like this stretch of the list, like from 100 to like 150, part of me is like, these are all in the wrong order. Like, part of me is like, this is all messed up. How did this end up being how this works?
Listen, when you're in the thick of it, this is what happens.
Yeah, definitely. Like when you're judging things as they come, as opposed to like, well, but I remember this movie 10 years later way better.
Yeah, that's why I stuck to looking at where the 1930s movies were.
Sure.
Right? Because if I were to look at some of the 1930s movies that are above, say, 146, it's like, well, this could potentially be better than that. But there's a 40s movie below that one that I know is better than this one.
Yeah,
so
it starts to get weird, right?
Yeah.
So what I did, I wasn't looking so much as at 30s movies as I was looking at like the other like rated H for horrific British movies. So like The Ghoul, The Man Who Changed His Mind, that kind of stuff. So I was sort of curious where some of those were. The Man Who Changed His Mind is at 99. And like right below that is like Eve Piri and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I was like, okay, like this is not as good as some of those movies. It's not as good as like The Housemaid, right? So I was looking down from there, and what caught my eye was Student of Prague from 1926, which also is like a very like atmospheric sort of movie. And so I was like, okay, this isn't as good as that. Let's keep looking down. And, you know, then I hit like The Bad Seed and Village of the Damned, which are very like well regarded, but we didn't really like them as much. And then 114 was Lady Vampire. I don't know. I guess I just ended up thinking like, you know, below that's like The Wasp Woman and Cult of the Cobra and a bunch of stuff that's like fun, but not really great in terms of the atmosphere. Like the 1959 Yahtzee Kaiden, which is like the most basic version of that. Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll at 122, which we had like so much to say about. So I ended up ranking this at 114, which I think is probably too high. Like now that I do
feel like it's a bit too high.
You've said your piece. I think it's a bit too high. Where were you looking again? 140.
The new 147 is what I'm thinking.
The new 147. Yeah. So Invisible Ghost is the one where Bela Lugosi's looking out the window at his dead wife in the rain, right?
I believe it's the dead wife who's looking out in the rain, but yes.
Yeah, she's in the rain outside, and he's looking out the window at her from inside. That's what I was meaning.
Cool. We're saying the same thing.
Wonderful. And then below that is Strangler of the Swamp.
Which was like the American remake of...
Yes.
Things.
Fairman Maria.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and like, this is probably better than The Ghoul. It's better than Beast with Five Fingers. I think... So I'm going to argue that this should go below White Zombie at 148.
Why is that?
Because although White Zombie's like a little hokey, it does have like the charisma of Bela Lugosi kind of anchoring it. Mm-hmm. And sure, so does Invisible Ghost, but Invisible Ghost is also like not as well done.
Yeah.
And I think that Telltale Heart is very well done, but none of the actors really have the same presence that's like elevating the picture, you know? Like, yes, Buddy in this movie is reminiscent of Conrad Veidt, but he isn't Conrad Veidt. And how much better would the movie have been if he was, you know?
That's fair. Yeah, cool. I'm good with that.
Okay. So entering the list at the new number 148 is The Telltale Heart from 1934.
If you would like to see this list, you can go to our website, screamscenepodcast.com. There you can find links to the many episodes that we have mentioned today, as well as our appeals box. If you would like to contest that we reevaluate where we've placed Hurst's Telltale Heart, you can drop us a line there, or you can reach out over email at screamscenepodcast@gmail.com.
I'm really looking forward to hearing from someone who cares a lot about this movie that has no home video release and that I couldn't find evidence of until like this year.
No, I want to hear from Hearst heads.
Ah, yes. Yes.
I want to hear your passion.
Scream Scene updates every other Wednesday on SoundCloud and Spotify and YouTube podcasts and wherever else fine podcasts can be found. You can subscribe to the show using our RSS feed, and you can help support the show by heading over to our Patreon at patreon.com/Scream Scene Podcast, where you're going to find all kinds of like extra goodies and bonus content, like Sarah writing about seeing the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Baltimore recently.
Yeah, so he lived in Baltimore. So the museum is built out of his house, or rather what remains. And he also famously died in Baltimore. Mm-hmm. So I visited his grave and wrote that. And yeah, that's up on the Patreon.
Do you remember the name of that like literary rival of his who wrote like the really slanderous obituary after Poe died?
Yeah, I mentioned his name in the but I can't remember what it is. It's like three names.
Yeah, and like everyone in that
century. And the
last
one was like Nimby.
Sure.
Like Grosby.
Sure.
Grimwald. It's like some of the like a name that you would hear in one of those like Rowling American wizard.
Okay.
It's like Griswold.
I don't know. But the point is that he came at the king and he did not miss.
I don't want to say that I'm like, Poe
died in Baltimore. That's the joke.
Oh. Okay.
The joke is that Poe died in Baltimore.
Oh.
And I was making a wire reference. Yes, there you go.
Yeah. See, I started overthinking and thought I needed to clarify that, like, while I might not be the biggest fan of Poe, obviously great for horror and everything, but I think he's a little overrated. It's like, cool, you're good at one thing, let's do other things too. I mean,
he did a lot of different things.
Yeah, but it's like, okay, guy, like, I get it, but like,
it's fine, he's dead now.
But I also just don't want to be like lumped in with like Sarah agrees with Griswold or whatever the fuck his name is.
Yeah, no,
because like, no, I do not.
No, that guy was terrible.
Yeah.
I was just making a wire reference because he died in Baltimore.
Okay, I apologize for not getting your reference.
To learn more about Poe dying in Baltimore and his grave and everything else, head on over to patreon.com/Scream Scene Podcast, where you can become a patron of the night for as little as $1 a month.
So I have a feeling what we're going to be watching next. Why don't you tell me anyways?
We're watching The Telltale Heart from 1960. So our next episode will be back in the year that we left off at to talk about a low-budget Telltale Heart adaptation from Britain from 1960.
We will see you then, creatures of the night.
Bye.
Bye.